Hello, G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about defining evidence, necessary abstractions, and pre-moves, framing points, arguments, and cases, as featured in The Map is Indestructible. And this paper is going to be making the point that evidence is relative to definition, and that as a result you can always adjust what evidence is proving or disproving, or have something avoid the evidence simply by changing the definition of it. And you cannot arrive at a definition from, say, an argument or a case, that the definition comes beforehand, but based on what is that definition? Like, where does that definition come from? It seems like it would have to come from something that is not, say, as objective as a scientific study or statistical analysis or so on and so forth. But of course, that would mean that there's always involved an element of the subject, that we cannot evolve the involvement of the subject. So, for example, if I define America's current system as capitalist, then the 2008 financial crisis is evidence that capitalism doesn't work. However, if I define the current system as a mixed market, then the 2008 crisis isn't evidence against the free market, but against mixed markets and state intervention. If we define the socioeconomic system of the Soviet Union as Stalinism or Leninism, then we wouldn't think of the failure of the Soviet Union as evidence against communism. Rather, we would easily think that communism hasn't been tried yet. Hence, if I don't define the Soviet Union as communist, then the collapse of the Soviet Union isn't evidence against communism. Likewise, if I don't define America as capitalist, but rather say a Banktocracy or something, then the 2008 financial crisis can actually be used as evidence for the need to try true capitalism. So what we see here is that if the financial crisis is evidence against capitalism, would depend on how we define capitalism. And I can always simply argue that the current socioeconomic system is not true capitalism. Therefore, it does not function as evidence against capitalism, but maybe a mixed market. But of course, who defines what is a mixed market? Who defines what is capitalism? And so what we end up having is a situation where if we just are trying to argue what disproves what, or what's evidence of what ideology or system, then basically conversation or debate can't go anywhere, because what's just going to happen is everyone's going to redefine paradigms or systems to avoid the implications of the evidence, and so there's not going to be much advancement, say, in democratic debate. Does this mean that capitalism is relative and that there is no true capitalism? No, not necessarily. That's a different question. My point is simply that a theory can be defended by redefinition, and when such is done, evidence that may have once been thought of as evidence against the theory will no longer apply. Whether or not this is a valid move is a different question, and gets into the question of what is the right version of the theory, and how do we get the right version? Questions of which should be noted there may not be any right answer. So we're not saying that it's all relative, but we are saying that one of the ways that ideology can always defend itself is through redefinition, or redefining what framework a study is for. Now, again, this would also mean that if we think that we can avoid the involvement of the subject, as Cadell will talk on, and David and Cadell actually had a talk just about this very topic, we really can't do it because the definitions of terms, the frameworks, all come before the study. So if we go, oh, well, it's not really a matter of my opinion, let's just look at the data and see if capitalism works or not. Well, that data can't tell you if your understanding of what is capitalism is right. So basically what that would mean is you can't use studying to get out of thinking. And Cadell had that wonderful Substack about his conversation with David on the thinking crisis. And what David was warning about is how there's a lot of people now who basically want to use studies, or they think they can repeat an experiment and get the same results. Therefore, they don't have to think. The repetition is evidence, but of course David makes the point that repetition is not evidence, that you have to have the involvement of thought. Well, basically this paper on defining evidence is just making the exact same point, is that you always have to think. At some point there has to be thinking about what is capitalism that no study can give you. And this logic would apply to Christianity, to America, to marriage, to love. You can go on and on and on and on. Like, no matter what topic it is, the case that the evidence proves or disproves, the defining of that case, the definition of that case cannot be derived from the evidence, because what is evidence comes after the creation of a case that phenomenon can be evidence toward, and that gets you into the paper, the self-delusion, the towardness of evidence, and the paradox of judgment. So you can never remove the involvement of the subject. So for example, let's say you have a study that shows 60% of Americans are unhappy with capitalism. Well, that's not going to tell you if those Americans define our current socioeconomic system as capitalism, and if it's right to see our current system as capitalistic. Also, it's not going to tell you if just because they're unhappy doesn't mean they would prefer communism. Maybe they're unhappy with capitalism, but they would think that communism is worse, right? Also, that doesn't tell you what unhappiness means, or if unhappiness warrants political action. These are all things that have to be decided outside the information, the data. Also, too, from an ideological standpoint, let's say you found out there was a correlation between rising rates of depression and the loss of religion. Well, you could simply say that that's only because religion has so brainwashed people that it's going to take a few generations before the loss of religion stops leading to depression. That, in fact, it's not evidence that we shouldn't bring back religion, but that we need to pull, kind of go full steam ahead to make sure we get to the place where the loss of religion doesn't cause depression. So all of the responses to the data and ways to avoid the implications of the data, the data can't avoid that. The data can't make sure that people don't interpret themselves away from the data. That's all up to people. And yet, here's the kind of the key problem. People tend to make these kind of hermeneutical moves to make the data fit with their ideology as they want, and then act as if that move is justified by the data, as if it's in the data. They say, oh, well, the facts show that there is a rising rate between depression and religion. Well, that just shows that people are brainwashed by religion, and we really need to get rid of it. There's almost a speaking as if the interpretation is in the data. That doesn't make any sense, of course, but that's kind of the sleight of hand that can occur that becomes very ideologically useful. And of course, you can't say for sure that the data doesn't mean people shouldn't engage, that interpretation is wrong, but it's also not the case that interpretation isn't in the data, which is actually how people can often act. The paper will give some more examples, but ultimately, it is important to note that the definition of terms or the defining of a framework comes before studies and before research. And so, how do we decide what framework, what definitions we should use? Well, you're going to have to do abstract reasoning. You're going to have philosophy. You're going to have the subject. And then the question simply is, are you good at it? Are you good at abstract reasoning and logical reasoning outside of scientific study or outside of quote-unquote objective data? And if the answer is no, then there's a very high likelihood that data is just going to be used in service of avoiding thinking. And we're probably just going to get sucked into the zeitgeist of the day without even realizing it. Because if we don't think about our framework, we usually just absorb the framework of the day, of the hour, of the moment. And so that's very problematic. So definition precedes evidence. You have to define things before you can start finding evidence for it. And that means, evidence justifies cases, but evidence doesn't justify definition. Definition is determined through philosophy, metaphysics, and ontology. Science may tell us what a chair is made out of, but ontology helps us argue those parts compose a chair. You can never get from, say, wood, bricks, piping, electricity, home. That has to be something you arrive at. You can get at that as being the competition of something, a phenomenon, quote-unquote, like a house. But if you want to define that as a whole, that's going to require some sort of abstract reasoning that's not found in the composition. And evidence is always located in definition. If I look for evidence that eating animals isn't always wrong, I search for this evidence with a definition of what an animal is already in mind. And who's to say that definition is correct or not? Can science tell you? Science can maybe provide some useful data on composition, or maybe help you determine if animals feel pain or not. But ultimately, if you decide that feeling pain equals sentience equals right to life, that all becomes an ethical question, and then the question is, what is the basis of the ethics? And that gets you into philosophy. Now, funny enough, once you move into philosophy, you actually start to realize that you can't determine true capitalism, true communism, that almost the question of what is the true form of the framework is a waste of time. Really, what can happen is when you skip the philosophical step, you don't realize that the search for, the assumption of a framework or using studies to prove capitalism or disprove capitalism or prove animals, that's kind of not the point. You actually are kind of wasting time. Instead, really, ultimately, you just have to ask, does it work or not? Like, is this decreasing poverty, for example? You choose a metric. Like the question of, is the current system true capitalism or not? Well, that's kind of a Gödel-esque problem. You can't really achieve that kind of certainty. But what you can do is examine instead what are the consequences, what are the concrete on-the-ground consequences of the current system. Is this the metric that we want or not? So, funny enough, one of the moves that happens when you realize that you can't escape the subject in philosophy is you actually stop using more quote-unquote objective studies in service of verifying ideological frameworks. In a weird sense, what actually can kind of happen is when you don't engage in philosophy, you end up almost being more abstract in your science, in your studies, because you end up using them in service to verify or disprove an abstraction that does not apply. So you actually kind of stop thinking, and funny enough, like as Davoud and Cadell were saying, that we can use studies and repetition and so on and so forth to stop thinking. Funny enough, you become more abstract when you stop thinking, because now you're using these studies to find connections or correlations that aren't concrete, that aren't real. And so that's kind of the big irony. Once you realize you have to have the involvement of the subject, well, then you realize certainty is not possible, and then you can't allow any premises into your studies that require certainty to be justified. And so you become much more phenomenological, much more concrete, much more open to particular circumstance, as opposed to looking for kind of general universal paradigms that probably can only work by assuming some sort of definition of a thing, of a paradigm or a framework or whatever, that isn't justified. So in a really funny way, that once you realize you have to be involved in the subject, you actually end up being less abstract, precisely because you're aware that you have to make a decision. And if you have to make a decision, you're going to probably make it more particular and more concrete and more based on lived concrete experiment. Now that means the implications of studies are going to be much more limited. They can't be as universal in general, but that's arguably probably a good thing, because I think kind of often we can use studies or experiments to start making general claims about what people should generally do, and then we're dealing with universals, and then that's when we start risking totalitarianism, force, oppression, things like that. Now, at the same time, so basically also what just kind of ends up happening is that when we don't take seriously the involvement of subject, then the science is still going to smuggle in the involvement of the subject, which means there's going to actually be a zeitgeist and ideology behind it all, but you're not going to be able to acknowledge that it's there, and therefore science comes to be in service of the ideology of scientism. And yet it should be noted that one of the reasons we try to remove the subject from our thinking is because of, well, ideology, because of religious wars, because of fanaticism. You know, there's this idea that people without science are pretty crazy. You could see the Enlightenment and liberalism as a movement, and secularism as a movement of the religious wars of Europe, or that's at least what has been claimed. So it's for good reason that there's been an effort to remove the subject. The problem is that you can't remove the subject, even if it would be nice if you could. Somehow you could make that argument. You just can't, because you're always going to have to make decisions about the definitions of terms and the frameworks and so on and so forth. So instead of trying to avoid the subject, we have to master the subject. We have to master discernment. We have to master abstract reasoning. We have to become better subjects and condition ourselves better. We've attempted now the road of the subject without philosophical and scientific training. And indeed, the idea of science can actually make us better at being subjects, because we can be more critical of ourselves in a constructive way. So science as an idea and a mental model is extremely important for the cultivation of the subject. But it cannot replace the subject. We instead have to be better at being subjects. And that gets us into Nietzsche, Hegel, and so on and so forth. But it also should be noted that if the subject is involved, then you always have the problem of the possibility of using evidence and all of that frameworks in service of ideology, which means it can be used in the service of making a map indestructible. But what I mean by that will have to be explained in the book. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.